Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our second class on Stami Einam, which is wine. Okay, and we're talking about what's the problem if a non-Jew, and then we'll get into it, a secular Jew, touches an open bottle of wine. And first, we're going to try and understand this from first principles of the original Isur. And the original prohibition was not general wine. The original issue was that someone would do it for idolatrous practices. And that the average non-Jew at the time was an idolater, which is obviously not the case these days. But Shulchan Aruch codifies, Maga Goy, if a non-Jew touches the wine, Asur b'hana'ah, it is forbidden even to get benefit from it, but tzarich shlosha t'naim, but it requires three conditions to be met for it to be prohibited. Echad, she'itkafen liyaga. The first one is he has to have intent to touch it. La'afuke tinok shenagad elav b'kavanahu. That excludes a child who touches it, who is not of has no intent. V'chein apuke nafal lebor va'alamet. And similarly, someone who fell into the cellar and died. So clearly, that person did not have intent to touch it. So, if the person has to have intention to make it prohibited. Sheni, she'ada shu yain, the person needs to know that it is wine. And thirdly, shelo yehe osek b'davar acher, the person cannot be involved in another matter. So the person has to have basically full intention. He needs to know exactly what he's doing, knows that it's wine, and he can't be multitasking. If they're multitasking, then it's not going to be an issue. Harambam goes on, Ketzad hi hanegia she'oseh ba'akum hayayin. What is the contact by a non-Jew that prohibits the wine? Shehu sheyaga beyayin atzmo, bein biyado, bein b'sha'im varav, shedarkan lenasech behen b'sheyashachshech. So what's going on here? It's when he touches the wine itself, either with his hands or with another limb that is customary to use for libations, and he shakes the wine. So it has to be wine which should be fit for libations. He has to do it with one of his limbs, and he has to shake the wine. The Torah writes that this is not only when the Gentile touches the wine directly, but even if he touches it via a vessel and shakes it. So he says here, Lo shna naga biyado o b'davar acher, shebiyado asur b'hana'ah, afilu b'shichshuch ba'alma. It makes no difference whether he touches it directly with his hands or with something else in his hands. So it makes an example, he's wearing gloves. It is prohibited to derive benefits, even if he just shook it. V'lo yatzak mimenu klum, he didn't pour it at all. Afilu bepiv, and even if he drank from it, sheshata mimenu, or shematzetz, or he sucked from it, b'minaket shebechavit, from a straw of the barrel, va'alehu lepiv, and it went up to his mouth. Kol hayayin asur b'hana'ah. In all these cases, the wine is prohibited even from benefit. And as we saw here in note 17, as we discussed yesterday, when we say here it's forbidden for benefit, that's specifically when it was idolatrous purposes. As we learned last week, there's room to be lenient, especially in a case of financial loss, since now most non-Jews are not idolaters. The Shulchan Aruch continues, Ketzad hu hanegia she'oseh bar hagoy hayayin b'hana'ah. What is this definition of touching to which a Gentile renders the wine forbidden, and put in parentheses, from which to derive benefit as well? She'yega biyado baraglo. That is when he touches it with his hand or his foot. And the Rama adds, V'yesh omrim, and there are those who say, De'im naga baraglo, if he touched it with his foot, Eino oseh b'hana'ah, de'en derech nisuch b'kach. If he kicked it or touched it with his foot, that's not the way of doing a wine libation, and therefore it would be, there are those who say that that would be, you wouldn't be allowed to drink it, but there wouldn't be a prohibition of benefits. Shulchan Aruch, or b'davar acher, or with something else, biyado, he holds in his hand, v'yishachshech, and he shakes it, afilu b'piv, even if it's in his mouth. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah states that if the non-Jew pours the wine, then it's forbidden even if he doesn't shake it. As it says here, Amar Rav Papa said, Oved Kochavim, a non-Jew, Adana v'Yisrael, Akova, Chamra Asir. If a non-Jew is pouring the wine from the barrel and a Jew is holding the bika, the kuva, into which it is poured, the wine is still prohibited. Now why? You'd say the Jew is standing there watching him. So why isn't it like the milk, which we permit if a Jew is watching? My timer, ka'ate mikoach oved kochavim ka'ate. The reason is that the wine comes out of the barrel, it comes out by the force of the Gentile's action. And therefore we go by his mindset, and it doesn't matter that the Jew is there, we are concerned that there are other forces involved. The Rambam accepts this statement as halacha, as well into the following ruling. Natal keli shel yain, if he, the Gentile, took a vessel of wine, vehegbiho, and he lifted it up, veyatzak hayayin, and he poured from it, afa pi shelo sheichshech, even though he didn't shake it, ne'asar, it's forbidden, sharei ba hayayin mikocho, because the wine is coming because of his strength. Hagbia v'lo sheichshech v'lo naga muta. If he lifted up the wine but did not shake it, then in that case, or touch it, then in that case, it is permitted. Another possible manner where the Gentile can render the wine forbidden is if the vessel containing the wine is open and the Gentile moves it even without picking it up. This is accepted by the Shulchan Aruch, though the Ramah is more lenient. Says the Shulchan Aruch, Yesh mi she'omer, there is one who says, she'im achaz goy bekli patuach shel yain, that if the Gentile was holding an open container of wine, v'shachshachon, he shook it, afa pi shelo hegbiho, even though he didn't lift it up, v'lo naga b'yain, he didn't directly touch the wine, ne'esar, it is forbidden. Says the Ramah, v'rabim cholkim, and there are many who argue, lomar, and say, dim shechshech begufo shel hakli b'lo hagbaha, that if he shook the bottle but didn't lift it up, lo mikre shichshuk, that's not really considered shaking. Therefore, one does not need to be strict in a case of financial loss. Yudchet, if a non-Jew took a vessel of wine and picked it up and poured the wine, even though he did not shake it, that case it is forbidden. Sharei bahayai mikocho, because the wine is being poured because of him. That's why it's coming out. Hagbiyah v'lo shichshech v'lo naga muta, and if he lifted it up and did not shake or touch it, then it is permitted. V'kol shekain she'eno oseh b'negiyat hakeli lachud, and certainly he does not forbid it merely by touching the vessel. So here, although the rules as presented here are somewhat detailed, it's clear that a Gentile simply touching a bottle of wine without moving it does not prohibit it. It also seems that if the Gentile only opens the bottle but does not raise it, shake it or pour it, the wine is also not prohibited. So why is it that we're so careful about a non-Jew touching the wine if we can see here that there are certain cases where it might well be permitted? Well, we also have a concept called lo plug, which is, yes, there are halachot, which is very clear, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do, but as you saw, it's pretty technical. So rather than saying a non-Jew can do this, but he can't do that, we're going to say, don't touch it at all, okay? And that's going to remove ourselves from any situation of doubt. And the Sefer HaKashrut codifies this, and summarizes all the different possibilities. And you can have a look at that in your leisure over there. The Yalkut Yosef writes that in a case where the wine is poured by the Gentile, only the wine that was poured is prohibited, but not the rest of the wine in the bottle. So we can see here that there is room to be lenient in such cases where b'diavad, after the fact, if someone did something, it's only the cup that they poured. And again, one might be in a ruling where it's not as strict. But as I said, lema'aseh, practically speaking, we generally say it's best to avoid having these types of wines on the table and to just use yain mevushal. But here Yalkut Yosef says, if he poured from the bottle of wine into a cup, whatever is in the cup is prohibited, i.e. what he's pouring for himself, so it's only he's going to drink that, and what remains in the bottle is permitted. Similarly, if he lifted the open bottle, it does not become prohibited. The Darkei Tshuva notes that some Anshe Ma'aseh are stringent not to drink wine even if a Gentile only looked at it. And I think this is where we might get into this custom that people are strict in all situations here. As the Darkei Tshuva says there in bold, afilu biriat keli hayayin lo hayu shotin af al pi shelo naga bo. That even if the wine was looked at, they would not drink it, even though it was not even touched. The Ben Ish Chai cites the same custom as the Darkei Tshuva, but adds that if an Ishmaelite sees the wine, so a Muslim, there is no reason for this stringency at all, even as an act of piety, because again, what's our position? That Muslims are monotheists, and so therefore we have no concern about idolatry. Okay, and you can see that there in source 48. Now, I can go into this at length, but I want to stop here because it's not that practical. Again, most cases, you're just going to say, don't use that wine if you're going to have non-Jews at the table. And again, as we talked about last week, having non-Jews at the table is permitted under certain circumstances. There are a few limiting factors, such as on Yom Tov, although you are allowed to have someone over who is in the process of conversion, although even that there is a machloket, there's an argument on, but again, I think for the Shem Chinuch, for the sake of educational purposes, one should be lenient in that. That's certainly how I rule publicly and privately. But here comes a more practical case, which is you're having secular Jews or traditional Jews who are not fully observant in your home. It could be family members, it could be friends, and by mistake you have the wrong type of wine. You wanted to have mevushal wine, but you have regular wine which hasn't had this boiling. What happens in that case? The Shulchan Aruch says as follows. Well, let's go to the introduction. We saw in the shiur on Bishul Akum, the one who desecrates Shabbat publicly, a one who sins out of spite, what's known as mumar lahachis, are considered like non-Jews concerning certain areas of halacha. The Shulchan Aruch codifies this within the halachot of shechita. And he says here, meshumad lahachis, an apostate out of anger. Even though it's just one area of Jewish law, or meshumad elelim, or who worships idols, or lechalel Shabbat b'fahesia, or he breaks Shabbat publicly, or meshumad lekol Torah, or is an apostate for the entire Torah, afilu chutz mishtayim, even if he all of the Torah except these two, which is worshipping idols and breaking Shabbat, those two those two are stricter than everything else. Dinok Goy, he is considered like a non-Jew. Umisha eno choshesh b'shchita v'ochel nevelot belot te'avon af al pi she'eno oseh lahachis dinok mumar lahachis. One who's not concerned about shechita and eats meat that is not properly slaughtered without desire, even though he does not do so out of anger, he is considered an apostate out of anger. Okay? So if someone is not particular in a particular area here, so here, since he's being asked to do shechita, and he's not careful about eating kosher meat, which has been slaughtered properly, there we treat him like a mumar, like a non-Jew regarding shechita. He also, the Shulchan Aruch writes this again, that Yisrael shehishtamed, a Jew who becomes an apostate, or shehu machalel Shabbatot b'farhesia, or breaks multiple Shabbats publicly, harehu kagoy lechol darav, behold, he is like a non-Jew in all matters. The Rashba adds that even someone who does not believe in the words of the sages is considered a mumar lahachis, an apostate out of anger. The Rashba also specifies explicitly that this classification of such people as Gentiles applied with regard to yain nesech and stam yenam. So it applies to wine as well. Ava mishumad lechalel Shabbatot b'farhesia, o she'eno ma'amin b'divrei rabotenu, humin v'yeno yain nesech, Usfarav Sifrei Kosmin, v'yesh omrim af banav mamzerim. However, an apostate who desecrates Shabbat publicly or does not believe in the word of our sages is considered an apostate, and his wine is considered yain nesech, and his books are considered books of magic. Some say that even his children are considered mamzerim, which is very strict language. ועניין חילול שבת, או מי שעבר על דברי רבותינו לדעתו, או שהוא עובד עבודה זרה, שהוא מוחזק בו 3 פעמים, אבל פעם אחת או 2 אינו עושה יין נסך, ובפני 10 צריך שיחלל. And regarding the issue of desecrating Shabbat, or one who transgresses the words of the sages to follow his own position, or he worships idols, it is when he has done so 3 times. But if he only did this once or twice, his wine is still not considered yain nesech, and he needs to desecrate Shabbat in front of 10 in order to be considered as publicly desecrating it. So it has to be a public act in front of 10 people. The Sefer HaKashrut also codifies this. Mumar la'avodah zara or lechalel Shabbat b'farhesia, v'chein mumar lahachis afilu l'davar echad dinam kegoyim. Someone who is a mumar and worships idols, a Jew who worships idols, or a Jew who breaks Shabbat, or a Jew who is angry and refuses to keep even one mitzvah, they are like a non-Jew. Al kain me'ikar hadin, therefore, strictly speaking, mag'o al ser tayayin, his touch would also prohibit the wine. But all that being said, and I know everyone's getting worried now about having secular Jews over, we have a concept called tinok shenishba, which is a child that is raised in captivity among Gentiles, who never really learned the proper laws of Judaism. Such an individual is not considered a mumar, an apostate. And the Rambam explains this based on a Gemara to also include a child of heretics. Misha eno modeh b'torah ba'al peh, eno zaken mamre hamo b'torah, ela harei zeh bichlal haminim. One who does not admit the authenticity of the old Torah is not considered a rebellious elder that is said in the Torah, but it's rather a heretic. But what case are we dealing with here? Someone who denies the oral Torah from his own opinion, and follows his own opinion. He goes after his own opinion. And he goes after his own haughty heart. But those children who have erred and their children, and they were pushed away by their forefathers and were born into heresy, and they were raised in that world, they are considered like children raised in captivity among the non-Jews. And therefore, even though he later hears that he is Jewish and he sees the Jews and their religion, he is not considered responsible since they educated him on their mistaken ideas. Now, our question becomes, in today's world, what do we consider someone who grows up traditionally or in a secular home, are they doing it lahachi? So they doing it to anger? Are they doing it? What category do they fall in? Do we consider them like non-Jews or not? So we have here the responsa of the Yehuda Ya'aleh, which is written by Rav Yehuda Assad. And he wants to write that secular Jews who were never raised in an observant lifestyle, they may be considered a tinok shenishba. They're not doing it for any argument. They're doing it because they don't know any better. And the responder of the Rashba brought in the Beit Yosef, and we'll see this in English, in Siman 119 and 124, it seems there's no distinction between one who is entirely not responsible for his actions and other apostates who desecrate the Shabbat. But they must specifically desecrate Shabbat in public, meaning in front of 10 Jews, and do so repeatedly, as it's mentioned in Ketubot, or that the matter is well known, and he knows that it will be publicized. And to invalidate him from being a witness or from taking an oath, we would need to actually testify in front of him. And similarly, to prohibit his wine through touching, meaning to invalidate his actual body and consider him to be a complete Gentile. It is clear that if they did not testify all of this in front of him regarding the desecration of Shabbat, but they relied on the general heresy that spread, and it is known that they do observe the rest of the mitzvot of the Torah, and they are careful to avoid transgressing the prohibitions in the Torah, their status is not considered like a heretic with respect to idolatry, and they would render the wine forbidden by touching it. And also, the fact that nowadays, where the generation is quite parutz, what does that mean? They breach the rules of the Torah with no misgivings. One should, heaven forbid, not distance them too much and reject them with two hands, so that they should not become more free. It is better to embrace them with one's arms. From all of these reasons, it seems to me that even a Baal Nefesh does not need to be stringent upon himself, not to drink the wine that was touched by those who desecrate Shabbat in our times, about whom no one has testified before them in front of the Beit Din that they desecrated Shabbat in front of 10 Jews, as was mentioned earlier. So according to Rav Assad, most non-observant Jews cannot technically qualify as desecrating Shabbat, since in order to be conferred with such a classification, they would need to have been testified against in front of a Beit Din, which is not usually the case. In addition, treating them as not being Jewish would distance them from Judaism, which he acknowledges as not wise in modern times. What's the basis of all this? We're going to see a tshuva by the Binyan Tzion, Rav Yaakov Ettlinger, and he wrote that in the 18th century. Now, up until here, we have spoken about the strict letter of the law of how to judge those who desecrate Shabbat publicly. But concerning the sinners of Israel of our times, I'm not sure how to judge them, since due to our many sins, the leprous mark has been passed on to the majority of the people, to the extent that for most of them, desecration of Shabbat has been likened to being permitted. They don't even realize what they're doing. There are some who pray the Shabbat tefillah, make kiddush, and then they break Shabbat by violating biblical and rabbinic melachot. Now, although one who desecrates Shabbat is considered an apostate by denying Shabbat, one denies creation and the Creator, yet this person acknowledged them through his tefillah and making kiddush. Furthermore, for their children who grow up under their influence, who have not heard about the laws of Shabbat, they are exactly like Tzidukim, Sadducees, who are not considered apostates, even though they desecrate Shabbat, since they are following their forefathers' actions, and they are like a tinok shenishba, the ben hagoyim, like a baby who was kidnapped to be among the Gentiles. And therefore, he says, do not act brazenly towards the sages of the generation, are not considered intentional sinners. And he continues here, therefore, in my humble opinion, one who wants to be stringent and consider their wine as stam she'inam, okay, they can do that, tavo alav bracha, but those who are lenient also have what to rely on, unless it becomes clear to us that they know the laws of Shabbat and are brazen enough to desecrate it in front of the 10 Jewish people together, in which case this person is definitely a complete apostate and the wine he touched is prohibited. Many more recent Achronim cite these tshuvot of the Binyan Tzion and the Yehudaya Aleh, and Rabbi Menashe Klein writes that this, in his opinion, the majority of poskim are lenient about this question concerning the non-observant Jews of our times as well. As it says here, now in one responsa I wrote, the Rov poskim svira lehu, the mechalelei Shabbat Kodesh bizmanenu, domin letinokot shenishbu. Therefore, we should consider those who break Shabbat these days as like a child that was taken captive. According to Rav Yitzhak Yosef and the Yalkut Yosef, one may only be lenient for a person who desecrates Shabbat if they also make Kiddush and attend synagogue regularly. A leniency which would not apply to those who are entirely non-observant. So to the traditional, dare I say it, traditional Sephardic member of our communities who come to synagogue, especially for Meldados and for the Chagim, and they make Kiddush at home, how much should we give them a limud zechut rather than cast them out? As it says here, Omnam yesh omrim shim hu mitpalel b'Shabbat. The person does the Shabbat prayers, umekadesh al hayayim b'Shabbat. He makes kiddush on Shabbat, and says zecher l'maaseh bereshit, even though he's mechalel Shabbat b'Hesia. And don't say that if he touches the wine, it becomes prohibited. There are others who argue, but mekilim bazeh, but those who wish to be lenient, yesh lem al ma yismochu, have that which to rely on, ub'diavad she'avar mazag hayayin, especially if the wine has already been poured. Obviously, not everyone holds like this. Rav Moshe Sternbach is more machmir, and he writes to be if the reason for the halacha of prohibiting the wine and the bread is in order to distance ourselves from such people, if so, then even if it is not their fault, it should be prohibited. And here, this is a worldview position. Do we consider our co-religionists who are not observant, do we consider them like non-Jews and therefore we want to distance ourselves completely from them, especially socializing so we don't have intermarriage? Or do we consider them as full Jews who just don't know the laws properly, but if they did, would want to keep it? Rav Sternbach considers them like non-Jews. They're not people we'd want to associate with, and therefore that's why they want to be strict and consider their wine to be, touching the wine to be problematic. And that's why I'm saying this is not just a halachic thing. This is what's known as meta halacha, where it's the world view of how do we see our co-religionists? Do we see them as Jews or not? For those of us who see our brothers and sisters who are not observant as because they don't know or are not yet fully observant, or do we consider them outside of the tent? As you know, I'd like to consider them inside of the tent. Rav Eliezer Melamed observes in the Pnei Halacha, the majority of poskim in contemporary times are lenient in this review as well. And you can see that one as well in your own time. Continuing. It seems that even those poskim who are more stringent may still be lenient for individuals who are not yet observant, but have expressed interest in Judaism and are beginning to study Torah and observe some of the mitzvot, as they already are seeking to strengthen their religious commitments. This point is mentioned by the Sefer Kashrut, and you can see that here. Those who desecrate Shabbat publicly, but are growing closer to a life of Torah mitzvot and are learning about Judaism for the sake of heaven and with honest and truthful intentions do not prohibit wine when touching it. This includes guests who are not yet keeping all of the mitzvot, but come back regularly to be hosted for Shabbat meals and are becoming stronger in their observance. The Sefer Kashrut also mentions another leniency in the case for a wine that was served previously by non-observant individuals, may have been mixed with the wine being served now. In this case, it's also permitted to drink the wine, and we can see that there in source 61. Now, if we go here, we can now see the summary of these positions that we looked at. How does wine become prohibited? There are three basic conditions concerning the focus and intent of the Gentile for the wine to be rendered forbidden. The Gentile must intend to touch the wine. He knows it's wine. He's not going to do something. He's not doing something else at the same time. Number two, the touching that prohibits must be done with his hand or foot, or a vessel in his hand, and he must stir the wine. Three, pouring wine is also prohibits it. If he stirs it without lifting, it's prohibited according to Shulchan Aruch. The Rama permits it in a case of financial loss. The Darkei Tshuva Ben Ish Chai are stringent not to drink wine that a Gentile looked at, but if we know that the Gentile is not an idolater, there's definitely room to be lenient. Now, regarding our friends who are not observant, Shulchan Aruch, one who desecrates Shabbat and those who sin out of anger are considered to have the halachic status of a Gentile. And the Rashba says even if someone doesn't believe in the words of the sages. But the Rambam gives us this concept of Tinok Shenishba, of a child raised up in non-Jewish world, doesn't understand all of the mitzvot. We saw here the position of the Yehudaya Aleh and the Binyan Tzion, that their status is one of a baby that was kidnapped and they do not prohibit the wine. The Yalkut Yosef is lenient, especially with traditional Jews who both desecrate Shabbat but also do things like making Kiddush and going to Beit Knesset. Rav Sternbach in C is Machmir, is strict. It's not their fault, but we don't consider them to be part of the collective. The Pinei Halacha is Rav Melamed. The practical Halacha is to be lenient. The Sefer Kashrut, we can be lenient when someone is becoming more observant. And that's what I have to share with you. So again, just to summarize, if your worldview is that a traditional Jew isn't doing it to be angry with God, isn't doing it to be chutzpah, for lack of a better word, but is doing it out of, they don't know any better. They're not doing it for any other reason, but they are clearly love Hashem. They just don't know, they're just not particular with their practice. One doesn't need to be overly strict. Now, all that being said, what's the practical world? The practical world, people just make sure, oh look, I was checking the bottle, it says Yain Mevushal. Most wine made outside of Israel is Yain Mevushal for that reason, because you don't know who's going to drink the wine, who's going to pour the wine, maybe the waiter who's going to serve the wine, and so therefore we go into that situation. Whereas in Israel, there's a lot more wine available, which is not Yain Mevushal. But as we've seen from today, there is no reason to be overly strict, more so than we are. And I think sometimes we, as I mentioned before, we have this concept of lo plug. I don't want to say this was permitted for this person, but not for that person. And so therefore, I'm going to say it's all out. But I think we've seen tonight that there's definitely room to be more inclusive rather than exclusive. And when it comes to our worldview, we have to understand here, am I excluding all Jews who are not the same stripes as me? Do I say, okay, if they're Shomer Shabbat and Kashrut, they're in my tent, and if they're not, they're out? That's a problem. I would say anyone who's at my tent, anyone who's at my table, even my limited COVID table, I want to have influence on them for the better, and that's categorically how we should sit. If people, we want to have them in kahal, we want them to grow, we want to infuse them with the beauty of Torah life, excluding them is not necessarily the way to bring them close. And please God, it should be that everyone who is traditional will become more observant, and those who are secular will become traditional, and those who are observant will become more connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it should bring about the redemption b'mhera b'ameno amen. Are there any questions?
Rabbi, you mentioned earlier of someone who denies the Torah shebe'al peh.
Yes.
I'm thinking about, there's this certain group of very fervently Orthodox Jews who only believe in the Torah shebichtav and not the Torah shebe'al peh.
Who are they?
I'm thinking more in the area of Mea She'arim in Yerushalayim.
They don't believe in the oral Torah?
I mean, or the Karaim, I think they're called.
Oh, Karaites. Yeah, so Karaites, yeah, so that's the problem. A group of Karaites, they would fit outside of this framework because they're not practicing traditional Judaism. When I'm saying traditional Judaism, I'm talking about traditional Ashkenazic Judaism, traditional Sephardic Judaism, where they have a framework. The Karaites, their problem is they denied fundamentals that we believe in. And that breakdown, that shift broke 2,000 years ago and has continued. Our rabbis throughout the generations have tried to show a distinction between the Karaites, where there is a problem with what they actually believe, and with Jews who just don't know any better but are traditionally minded. The Jew who is traditionally minded but doesn't know is very different to the Jew who knows and is preaching a very different position. Rubisa, you had a question?
Well, I was wondering on that meta-halachic question that you're addressing there, are there any teshuvot that look at mental health as a component?
Can you
I mean, it's more of a I wonder.
Speak out more. Is their lack of observance is because of mental health?
Yes, and certainly if somebody follows the camp of knows and angrily rejects, if they can still be embraced in an active way, if it is known that there's a mental health problem, that they experienced a trauma, something like that we're still trying to welcome them back in and work through that mental health situation.
Yeah, so again, that would be a situation where I would say even someone who has a full 12th grade education, even someone's been on a gap year program, what we consider someone who really knows Judaism. I think one of my rabbis in yeshiva, I can't remember who exactly, but I was shocked to say that he said, what's considered being a tinok shenishba? Anyone who doesn't have a full knowledge of all Torah, Poskim, Shulchan Aruch, and all the codes and all the tshuvot. So basically, virtually everyone could be considered tinok shenishba who falls away. And his point was that, forget the question of mental health, there's virtually no one today other than the top poskim who can say, oh, you know what? I know the entire Torah and I'm rejecting it. We think about who is the only one of the few examples in the Talmud is Acher, the teacher of Rabbi Meir. So he is someone who became a mumar lahachis. But there's very few other cases. And why did they use him as an example? Because he knew so much Torah. Most people don't know Torah properly, and therefore we can't consider them to do that. So let's say you have a teenager, you have someone in their early 20s who's struggling with some mental health issues and they're angry at God or whatever it might be. That's still a tinok shenishba. They still don't really know. And let's say you could give me someone who really fitted into that category and they did have mental health issues. For sure, there is room to be lenient and to say that what's going on here is a deep situation of melancholy. It's interesting, just to bring in Navi, King Saul, Shaul HaMelech, he makes it into Olam Haba. And you might think he shouldn't get to be in Olam Haba. Look at some of the tremendously terrible things he did during his life, like ordering the city of Nov, of the Kohanim, to be wiped out. And one of the answers given is because of his melancholy, he wasn't in the right mind. And so therefore you can't consider him to be judged that well. And the other answer being that when he died, his death was a kapara for his sins. But we don't consider anyone, even someone who you think should know better, we don't say that that person knows everything. And again, this meta-halachic position is, how much do you want to push someone away? Now, I'm not saying that it should be completely bring everyone in possibly, but you know, when you have an argument with like a feisty teenager or even a feisty 40-year-old who's grown up, they think they know all of Judaism and they think that Sephardic Jewry or Orthodox Judaism is a complete waste of time and you're stuck in the old days and when are you going to get in the modern world? Got news for you. Those people, however lahachas they present themselves, they're completely tinok shenishba. They don't know what they're rejecting. If they only knew the beauty of Sephardic life or of an observant lifestyle, they wouldn't think like that. It's coming from a place of insecurity. It's coming from a place of not knowing, and therefore our job, we don't do a very good job at it, but our job is to bring them back. How are you going to bring them back? Not by telling them their wine, which they brought, sorry, we can't drink that. And we have other problems with bringing it. Perhaps they brought it on Shabbat in the car and you can't get, there are some issues with it, but I'm saying if you're going to start like that, you're going to end up in a dangerous situation. Now, again, obviously there are ways around it where you can behave in a way which doesn't draw attention to it, but I think we can all see that this can be more challenging and not so beneficial. Any other comments?
Yeah, and generally, as far as today, the shuls get around this whole issue in terms of the wine by pouring the little cups and then taking away the wine, or if it's left, I don't know what they do with it afterwards, but maybe somebody drinks it. And as far as when people have guests in their home and there's either a question in terms of the frumkeit of the person or that it'd be a gentle, let's say on Yom Tov, that they also pour the wine, or if they leave it on the table, whatever is left, they just toss, or...
So again, so it said there, you can rely on the position that if it is wine which wasn't mevushal, that if they are, you can just say whatever they poured into their cup is prohibited, and the rest of the bottle is fine. However, as I said, most people are, if they're going to be concerned about that, they are strict on the whole bottle, but we saw there in the sources that one doesn't need to be strict in that matter. All right, have a wonderful evening, everyone. See you later.